Hey everyone. This time we are going to be talking a little bit about the Nintendo Player's Guides. These were books from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and they kind of changed, what they were over the years. In my opinion, they started off as kind of a supplement to the Fun Club newsletter, which was later known as Nintendo Power, and then they slowly turned into strategy guides. So let's talk a little bit about them and kind of where they got started. So the very first one was the official Nintendo Player's Guide. This had 90 reviews in it, supposedly. But what it really was just kind of marketing material for a bunch of different games. Mostly first-party Nintendo games, but there were quite a few third-party games in here as well. Only about 30 or so games got like a full-on walkthrough and kind of covered in like quite a bit of extent. The second half of it is just all of the other games that they said were going to be reviewed. They're really just covered in like a short paragraph and that sort of thing. This book came out in 1987, so yeah, it was pretty much marketing material, and it did a good job of showing just what was out there. Now we get into the second run of books. These were a little bit different and kind of felt like supplements to the Nintendo Power and to the Fun Club newsletter. Sorry about that. But these were, your top secret passwords for Nintendo. That was the Game Boy guide. You had one for the Super Nintendo. You had a Mario Mania one as well. And you also had the Video Game Atlas. These books were released between 1990 and 1992. I don't really have exact dates on when these books came out, but I do know that they were either mail away and then eventually you would be able to buy them in stores. Once you got to the Mario Mania book, that's when you could kind of see where Nintendo was really going with this. The Mario Mania book was essentially a strategy guide for Super Mario Land. Or Super Mario World, sorry. And that one really feels like an actual strategy guide because that's really what it does. It walks you through the entire game. And it also gives you a lot of history about Mario as well. It's a really great book, and if you're going to get one, that's probably the book that I would suggest. It's also got kind of a cool little piece of history in it, because that's really the first place that you would see that, Super Mario 2 was just a reskin of Doki Doki Panic. Or at least the Super Mario 2 that we got here in the US. The Game Atlas is kind of cool because it gives you a bunch of maps for different games. Or at least it tries to. When it gets to the Simon's Quest book, or the Simon's Quest part, they just sort of did the best that they could because that game is just incredibly confusing. So they tried to lay it out in a map and it just doesn't quite work out. The Game Atlas is actually the first one of these books that I had ever heard of. I heard about it from watching an AVGN skit, and he mentioned the Game Atlas, and that made me want to go and find it and kind of see what it was all about, which led me to this rabbit hole that I'm in right now, where I just wanted to learn more and more about these Nintendo Player's Guides. And it's been a pretty cool journey, especially with these first 6 books. Once we get past these, that's when, it transitions from being marketing material or being like very specific into being strategy guides. So in the 90s, the strategy guide boom was getting really big. And these were actual guides that you could go out and buy. They were physical books that you could get. The internet really hadn't been developed yet. Well, it had been developed, it was around, but it wasn't to the point where you could just go and find anything that you want at the time. At least in the US, it was pretty simple, and not a lot of people were on it. At least that's the way it felt for me. When I first got on there, I had no idea what I was doing, no idea where to go, and I was kind of limited by, what you could find on a school computer. I was never one for strategy guides growing up, but I can see how these would be incredibly helpful. Especially the Nintendo ones early on. They had a lot of really awesome artwork in them. So you got information about the game, but you also got a lot of really cool looking stuff in there. So they were just visually fun to look at. And this was kind of Nintendo's way of breaking into that market, because you had two big publishers at the time. You had Prima and you had Brady Games. And from another book that I've read about one of the guys who worked at Brady Games, there were some other smaller publications as well. But I don't really know those. I just kind of know Nintendo, Brady Games, and Prima. Nintendo ran with these strategy guides all the way up until the late 2000s. And that's kind of when they gave up on it. The internet sort of killed off these books. In some ways, I think that was for the best, because they were sort of publishing too many of them. A lot of times these books were being published at a loss, and so a lot of these companies were losing money on selling their books. And they usually weren't really worth it, especially when the internet came around and you could just find any of these anywhere. There is one more book that I want to talk about, because it's kind of weird. It's sort of this odd outlier that I don't really know why Nintendo made it. So I mentioned how after 92 they transitioned into strategy guides. Well, the outlier is the Super Game Boy book, which I'm not really sure why they made this. It is a very short book. We're talking sub 50 pages here. Or maybe more. It might be more than that. Somewhere between 50 and 70. It's a very short book. It just goes over what you can do with the Super Game Boy. And it just feels like it should have been in Nintendo Power. And it very well could have been. At least from the way I'm reading through this thing. It's very short. I don't really understand why it exists, and it's the only one that was published like that. There were no other books like this that were published. You didn't get one for the Virtual Boy, you didn't get one for the N64, you didn't get one for the GameCube, so on and so forth. It was just this weird peripheral in the Super Game Boy that they decided to make a book like this. And it was sold much like the first 6, and yeah, I don't really know why. So let's get into kind of the final thoughts on this whole thing. These books are really a time capsule. They're really fun to look at, and for some of the strategy guides, you don't need them anymore. There's no real reason to go back and look at them, because you can find all that data online. But they're really cool, especially the early parts of their strategy guides, because of all the kind of fun artwork and everything that's in them. You also have those first 6, which are mostly marketing material, or kind of novelty items. And those are pretty fun to look at and just kind of flip through and see what Nintendo was kind of doing back then. I feel like their initial idea was to kind of get at the market that wasn't buying Nintendo Power. Because contrary to what a lot of people will say, and most of it's kind of hyperbolic anyway, not everybody had a subscription to Nintendo Power back then. So yeah, those first 6 books are really kind of cool to look at. So while I didn't really get these books when they first came out, and I sort of discovered them later and everything, it's really cool to kind of flip through them, read about just the different stuff that was going on, read about the different games, what the developers thought about them, what Nintendo thought about them, and kind of see how Nintendo may or may not have been biased towards certain games. That's always the fun part to look through in these. So anyway, guys, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day, everybody. Bye.